Our special guest today is Professor Bruce Clarke. Good morning, Professor Clarke. And
hi there.
And good morning and good evening to everyone attending this discussion from different parts of the world. Now, time to introduce Professor Clarke formally. Bruce Clarke is the Paul Whitfield Horn Distinguished Professor of Literature and Science in the Department of English in Texas Tech University. His research focuses on systems theory, narrative theory, and Gaia theory. His professional positions include Baruch S. Blumberg Nasa Chair in Astrobiology at the Library of Congress, Senior Fellow at the Center for Literature and the Natural Sciences, Friedrich Alexander University, Erlangen-Nuremberg, and Senior Fellow at the International Research Institute for Cultural Technologies and Media Philosophy, Bauhaus Erlangen-Nuremberg University, Weimar. His latest book is Gaian Systems, Lynn Margulis, Neocybernetics, and the End of the Anthropocene, Minnesota 2020. This is the book we will be discussing today at length. Other books include Neocybernetics and Narrative, that's 2014, Post-Human Metamorphosis, Narrative and Systems, that's 2008, and Energy Forms, Allegory and Science in the Era of Classical Thermodynamics, 2001. He is the editor or co-editor of 7 essay collections, most recently Post-Human Biopolitics, the science fiction of Johann Strozinski, and with Manuela Rossini, the Cambridge Companion to Literature and the Post-Human, which is a brilliant book. I have read, it's a remarkable book. Professor Clarke co-edits the book series Meaning Systems, published by Fordham University Press. He also served on the curatorial advisory board at the Center for Art and Media, Karlsruhe, Germany, for Critical Zones, Observatories for Earthly Politics, directed by Bruno Latour and Peter Weibel. Since 2019, he has co-directed the transdisciplinary research project Gaian Systems, Planetary Cognition Lab, curating research, hosting workshops, and developing immersive experiences to deepen understanding of our embeddedness within a living planet. It's such a pleasure to finally have you here on the screen, Professor Clarke. And
thank you so much.
And thank you for agreeing to be part of this interview. It was such a pleasant surprise. So in our discussion today on Gaian Systems, Autopoiesis, and Neocybernetics, and that's what I have named this session, we will try to disentangle the debate surrounding the Gaian hypothesis as explored in Professor Clarke's most fascinating book, Gaian Systems, Lynn Margulis, Neocybernetics, and the End of the Anthropocene. And for the audience, if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box, or you can switch on your audio and ask them directly to Professor Clarke at the end of the session. I'll just take 5 seconds to admit everyone in the waiting room, and then we'll jump straight into the questions. Yeah, all done. Yeah, okay, let's begin. So this is my first question for you, Professor Clarke. So when you point to Lovelock's circular logic concerning Gaia, anticipating second-order cybernetics, are you looking at Gaia as a system operated by a continuous loop where the essential components are indestructible? Do you think that Gaia has a fixed volume of unalterable properties while others keep metamorphosing?
Okay. Definitely a continuous loop is would conform to my conceptualization. By the way, this is Hermes, and he likes to hang out. But here, why don't you pop down here? But the a continuous loop where the essential components are indestructible. That's not my conception. The components are physical, material, as matter and energy, rises to the state of living form, and as such, the components are always breaking down and reforming. The components are renewable. but they're not indestructible. And the system is about the continuous creation and decreation of the elements of the system. And so it's and I wouldn't, and of course, Gaia is not indestructible, but it makes sense to think that it's maintained itself in operation since it got going. A time will come when it's, conditions are not sustainable for this planetary system, at which point they won't be sustainable for what we call life. As far as a fixed volume, what that reminds me of is the matter of material closure. The idea that the planet, of course, the planet as is thermodynamically open to the flux of solar energy, but it's essentially materially closed in that the amount of infall of matter from beyond the Earth is negligible with regard to the total mass of the Earth. So basically, the planet does have a fixed volume of geological matter that is then part of the Gaian recycling that sustains that system. So the only thing unalterable then, well, I mean, I'm not comfortable with that word because in my conception, Gaia is also evolving in its as part and parcel of geological and biological evolution. Gaia reinvents itself, but the operational closure that comes with the autopoietic conception of Gaia is the constant, would seem to be the constant element, right? In terms of a systems theoretical, a continuity of the reconstruction of the unity of Gaia altogether.
Right. So while discussing autopoiesis of cellular life, Margulis uses a very intriguing term, which is sentience. So what is this sense making, or let's say, which you extensively discuss in your book, which is a proprioception? So is it linked simply to the survival of the agent or finding an indigenous space by modifying the immediate environment, what, let's say, Latour calls distributed intentionality? Or are we also attacking the anthropocentric centrality of man's consciousness and powers of sense creating? So is it, again, man versus the cellular life?
Well, let me come back to that. I mean, by and large, I accept these propositions, but let me take them one at a time. So when Margulis uses the term sentience in applying to all living systems, I understand her to be that this is her way of her renaming of what Maturana and Varela, the initial theorists of autopoiesis, what they called cognition. So they say autopoiesis is cognition, or that an autopoietic system, even at the basal level of a biological cell, is in cognitive relation to its environment. So when Margulis says sentience, I understand it as essentially that same idea, just renamed by herself and Dorian Sagan, as they talk, for instance, in their book, What is Life? Have a final chapter called Sentient Symphony, which is a beautiful metaphor for Gaia, basically. The sentient symphony, all the multivarious sentient entities that also have this ultimate connection within a planetary system. So that is, and so in inactive the sort of in the continuation of Maturana and Varela's philosophizing, let's see, sense making. That's also a synonym of cognition or sentience. That autopoietic systems, starting from life forms, although to me, well, I mean, there is a metaphorical leap. I mean, it depends on what you mean by sense. I mean, making sense. I mean, does that mean meaning? This is a whole other discussion that I think we'll get into a little later. I don't think of the sense that a cell makes as meaning in the sense that we think of meaning, but nevertheless, insofar as it's able to kind of select or respond to its environment in ways that lead to its continuation in being, that makes sense. that's the sense making that's involved there. So is sentience linked to the survival of the agent? Yes. I mean, that's another way of looking at it, but not in a kind of classical Darwinist, just survival. We gotta, as if it's always like you're always just struggling and competing to survive. No, it's just making your way as a living being, however that's possible to do. But finding an indigenous space by modifying the immediate environment, that's a perfectly good Gaian formulation, it seems to me. And I think you're right that Latour's idea of distributed intentionality, it is more or less the Latourian way of saying sense making or autopoietic sentience. And all of this, I mean, to me, the beauty of Gaia in post-humanist terms is that it's, I mean, it's displacing anthropocentric centrality of man's consciousness. I mean, it's not saying, I mean, we carry out sense making in terms of what we call meaning. At least consciously. I mean, in terms of the mentation to which of which we're capable over and above our, just sort of our survival as living beings. But the point is, and this is kind of all through the Gaia literature and Lovelock and Margulis's sort of reflections on the resistance to Gaia had to do with the quite, pretty straightforward displacement or decentering of the human from the phenomenon, from its perch atop the rest of the planet as conceived in humanist terms or in classical humanist terms in the Western tradition.
Right. So this is my shortest question probably. So regarding Gaia's planetary cognition, how much of it really depends on non-performing metabiotic actants, such as a stone, let's say? This really bothered me while reading your book. What is the performance of stone? Does it really have an impact because it really not moves on its own? It is acted upon. So what is that kind of impact on Gaia then?
Well, I think you have to shift your frame of reference to the planetary scale. In my theorization, the autopoiesis is driven from the biological components of the system. This is the source, and the cognitive element is contributed by the living system. So I don't conceive of stone as cognitive in and of itself. Okay, so I'm not a pan-psychic kind of That's not my idea here, but the geological component of the metabiotic conceptualization of Gaia that I've pursued is as the reservoir of the material elements that have to be available to living systems to carry out their autopoiesis. So at the planetary level, you've got tectonics. In other words, you've got the continuous recycling of the stony matter of the planet, at least at the level of the surface and the mantle, but also, as driven by the heat energy coming up from the core of the planet. And we know that plate tectonics are part and parcel of the necessary environment of Gaia. Okay, so stone is involved in this in sort of at that level. And then the other thing I think of in the Gaian literature, there's a robust discussion of rock weathering, which is the phenomenon by which living systems, especially the microcosm, right, the bacterial and component of the biosphere is, but also lichens and fungi, and that the stony matter that emerges to the surface of the planet immediately comes in contact with a biosphere that then is over geological time breaking down the stone and releasing the elements that are locked up in the formation of that stone, which was probably a biogenic. I mean, depending on the stone we're looking at, it may well have already been churned through Gaian processes, subducted back down to the mantle, fired and then reemerges. And so you have this very profound continuous geological cycling that's part of the dynamism of the planet. And that then interfaces with the biological dynamism in all kinds of pathways. But as far as my idea of planetary cognition is an intuitive, logical step from the conception of autopoietic Gaia. If Gaia is autopoietic, then the planet is cognitive because that comes with the concept of autopoiesis. Now, this is an intuitive leap that I make as a kind of philosopher, so make of it what you will. But it would be that the geological component is an element in the totality of this process, by which Gaia, I don't consider Gaia, I mean, if Gaia, yes, is cognitive or sentient, but that doesn't mean it has thoughts. It's not making meaning for itself. Rather, it's reproducing itself from moment to moment, according to the sort of its external and internal environments.
Right. So let's come to a question which is very essential, especially during our pandemic. So let's say humans and viruses share the same intention of destroying the place they inhabit. So ironically, a virus does it to proliferate itself, and the human to self-destroy, of course, by destroying the neighbor, let's say. So if the autopoietic Gaia continuously observes and selects elements that are self-bounded and participates in meaningful alliances and exchanges with their environment, what is the credibility of human being in such a system?
Well, that's one hell of a question. I've got to say, I don't agree with your premise. I don't think humans intend to destroy the planet. They know not what they do, although they should know. But it's not that we intend. I mean, here, Margulis, I like the way she thought about it. She just thought of humans like any other organism. Organisms expand to the limits of their I mean, it's in the nature of living beings to expand within their environment until they hit the limits of the possibility of their expansion. Now, in a well-developed ecology, these processes are kept in balance by biodiversity, right? So none can expand infinitely because they're pushed back upon by all of their neighbors. And when ecologies go out of whack, it's because this process is impeded, or certain crucial elements to that kind of workable truce or division of niches, right, is thrown out of whack. We know this ourselves by when our own microbiome goes out of whack. I know it myself when I took antibiotics for my acne when I was in 20s, and I got this terrible autoimmune situation because I was trashing my microbiome. Nobody knew about this stuff back when that happened, but I mean, that's a microcosm of this ecological observation. So Margulis thought of humans as, she thought of us as pioneer species. Okay, we're very recent in terms of the planetary ecology. And and what pioneer species do is they just expand until they hit their limits. Unfortunately, we have these big ass brains that allow us to expand everywhere. And so we're over expanding, but of course, and now we're hitting our limits. So she had this great image of, like, say you're a bacterium in a petri dish in this very tasty nutrient substrate that's given you everything you need. You think life is great until you hit the edge of the petri dish, and then you run out of space and you run out of nutrients, and your happy time is over. So I think we need to realize that we can't. That our economic systems are it's the limits of growth. I mean, the idea came out half a century. I mean, we're overpopulating, and we're demanding, we're pulling out more resources than so what this amounts to is destruction. But I don't think. But the intention to destroy, I don't quite buy that formulation. Well, I don't know how similarly, but if we turn to viruses, I mean, as I understand the pandemic, the origin is at least a reasonable construction of the origin is it's zoonotic. Right, the virus was, leaped from some other life form and then caught a ride in humans. Why did this happen? Because we're cutting down the forests, because we're destroying the habitat where the virus was just happily kind of had its niche that didn't intersect with human. Didn't interact with humans, but because we're expanding and we just think, what the hell do we need this forest for? We'll chop it down and grow, raise cattle for McDonald's hamburgers. So, I mean, but deeply ecologically thinking, viruses are very mysterious. They're kind of like the bacteria of 100 years ago, where we didn't even know they existed. And then we had to figure out what their part was in relation to life. And for the longest time, we just thought they were pathogens. And then Margulis and people, along with her, gradually unfolded the probiotic understanding of the integration of the bacterial, what she calls the microcosm, with the rest of life, which is essentially a symbiotic and mutualistic relationship where we all support each other's, we're mutually supportive. At least that's the that's the dynamic of a healthy ecology. So, but viruses, the origin of viruses is still fairly obscure, but what we seem to know is that they've been part of the evolutionary process. What they do is they move genes around. And so just like bacteria, most viruses are not pathogenic, just the bad actors. But of course, when they're bad, they're very bad. But so to me, the pandemic is a symptom of human overexpansion and sort of willful ignorance about our Anthropocenic power to affect the planetary ecology at a global level. So let's see. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know about the credibility of human beings, but the point is we need to reconceive of ourselves as part, and this is not a new thought, but we need, we just need to realize that we have to reintegrate ourselves into a planetary ecology and make but whether we can get our political act together at the global level to do this is dicey.
I think what I wanted to ask in this question is perhaps if the Gaian system would be majorly affected with the absence of human beings. Do you think? Oh,
well, no. No, we're just along for the ride like every other life form. I use that, I don't say species because I adhere to Margulis's thesis that bacteria don't have species because they with lateral, they have types and kinds, but they're constantly evolving and transmogrifying because they pass genes back and forth. And viruses are part of that process as well. So there's some really good papers on the ecology of viruses that have just come out in the last couple of years. I mean, they're coming out before the pandemic, but of course we had earlier SARS type events going on. But the ecological understanding of the sort of the place and that viruses have always been along for this ride as well. But just what's uncanny is that is their liminal status as, Margulis insists they're not autopoietic, right? They're not self-producing because they have to hijack a living system in order to propagate. So what's that? But nevertheless, the dynamics of viruses are part of the total ecology, and that's the way it's been for 2 or 3 billion years now. So they're completely integrated into Gaia, and that we're freaking out now about pathogenic viruses is part of the larger kind of ecological blowback.
Right. So in the end, do you take the Lovelockian turn of the very recent Novocene, where cyborgs take control of the human system, or really support Margulis's assertion that Gaia will sustain herself through all apocalypses. So Lovelock is producing another kind of togetherness, albeit a hierarchical one, of course, where the machines contemplate their own continuation by controlling organic life. So what I'm also asking here is, are both theories predicting the end of humans as we know them, or will there be a different kind of human species?
Right. I've got up on, there's a site called Alienocene. I think that's the name of the site. And I've got an article on the Novacene up there that also at the very end of Gaian systems I talk about, but my web article goes a little farther than what I've got in the book. Lovelock, at the age of 100, brings out another book right as I'm finishing mine. So I felt I needed to, so I asked my editor for another couple of months so I could deal with the Novacene. Now, what my feeling is that this idea of a Novacene in which the machines, it's just so science fictional. And I think that's the best way to. Lovelock is now writing science fiction, but seriously, the problem with it is, so he says that the intelligent machines, we're building them now. They're gonna become sentient. They're gonna and gradually they'll take over the planet, and for a while they will want to keep Gaia around to keep the planet cool. But if you read to the end, he says, but then a time is going to come when they don't need the air conditioning. They don't need to keep Gaia to keep the planet cool, and so they'll let Gaia go. And then it'll just be a planet of machines. To me, that's a horrific. That's just a. I find that a horrific scenario. He says we should be proud that we are the progenitors of the next phase of evolution, that where the machines are going to take over the sort of cosmic occupation of understanding the cosmos. And I just, I can't take it seriously. That's why I think it's but Lovelock is a mischievous chap, which Lynn always pointed out. And I think this is one last piece of mischief, but what I don't like is that he basically kills Gaia off. That's his scenario. You read it to the end, he just kills Gaia off. And where he's left with is an universe of an informatic universe, right? Where all the bits turn into it's, and I just don't accept that. I think it's information theory gone completely bonkers. But you've had these informatic philosophers. I just go back and read the Siberiad by Stanislav Lem, and it's the ultimate satire on this Pug the Pirate. The chapter on Pirate Pug is a total spoof on this informatic idea that Lovelock absorbed. Remember, the guy's now 102. So he absorbed information theory right as it was coming out through the guy that wrote Schrodinger, right? Back in the 40s. So when anyway, so that's Lovelock. I mean, he's amazing, but the Novacene is, I could have done without it. Now, Margulis. See, that's why you got to stay with Margulis, because Margulis, now, I mean, she said, we're not essential to Gaia in any way. And if we succeed in killing ourselves off by trashing the environment, that'll be a shame for us. But Gaia will adapt because we're not essential to the planetary ecosystem. And we are a kind of, and it's easy enough to think that we're a kind of pox. But Margulis thinks it's the height of human presumption to think that we, no matter how gnarly we get as planetary actors, could kill Gaia. Now, the machines might kill Gaia in Lovelock's scenario, but Gaia, there's no reason why Gaia should not persist until the cosmological environment won't work anymore. I mean, of course, when the sun burns out, for instance, or but even in early, I mean, Lovelock thinks Gaia is old. I don't know how much of that is. I mean, it is old, but he thinks it's that even the ice ages were a premonition of the system kind of losing control. So he even, his idea is that Gaia's got fairly short lifespan left. Margulis never really subscribed to that I ever saw. But it will, but it's not immortal. Let's see. So as we look out now, it looks like we may succeed in killing ourselves off, and that's I just don't believe machines can make it on their own. So I don't buy that scenario. But that won't be the end of Gaia, if that's any consolation. And there may well be lots of evolutionary time left for, some other critter to take a stab at being aware of the universe.
Right. So my next question is, so on the one hand, you agree with Margulis's claim about the sentience of living organisms. And on the other hand, you also supported the neo-cybernetic postulation that Gaia does not make meaning or sense. So are you referring to the human need to reduce Gaia's operations to notions of causality or frame it within recognizable domains of meaning making? So is this why you're calling Gaia a human order?
Right. Well, we were talking about this a little before, that sentience, cognition basically means ability to sense and respond to one's environment. However, a living system or a metabiotic system, which category, but in my that metabiotic, as I use that word, doesn't leave the biotic behind, but brings the biotic into a higher synthesis with, in the Gaian instance, the biosphere is systematically integrated with the geosphere, and therefore Gaia is not just the biggest living system, which was a common or a superorganism, right? That was a common sort of way of working on the Gaia idea that I think was eventually dispensed with properly. But Gaia as such then produces a kind of planetary sentience by which it fosters its own continuation. That's the conception here. But that has nothing to do with meaning as we experience it as bodies and minds that move through our environment within the medium of meaning, right? Which phrase I take from Luhmann's systems theory. Our conscious, and so cognition for us, is, historically the concept has been limited to this very specific thing that human minds do as part of their conscious experience, right? They cognize. Okay, so, but that's a very, and of course, that's a thing. But we cognize in terms of meaning that is then mediated by the linguistic structures that we absorb in our acculturation and all that, right? So we know what we mean by meaning because you understand me perfectly, right? Well, I'm kidding, but anyways, you're trying to understand me as I'm trying to understand your question. So we'll call that, we're making meaning here the best we can. But that has nothing to do with Gaian processes as far as I can see, which, in other words, it's really crucial to withdraw the projection or the anthropomorphosis or the personification, right? So that's the problem that Lovelock created for himself by giving his system a mythological name, which then just encouraged people to go off in all these various directions with regard to, oh, well, Gaia must, oh, it's a goddess. And therefore it has desires and whims and gets mad when you are bad. And then you get the Revenge of Gaia, which was Lovelock's book from 2006. And so, I mean, Lovelock, I mean, it's fascinating, but he plays fast and loose with metaphors and kind of doesn't, and then just mops up the collateral damage as he goes along. So that's what I mean. Now you see, mainstream science, to get to the part of your question about the human need to reduce Gaia's operations to notions of causality. I mean, at the level of the mainstream scientific reception of and resistance to Gaia is the problematics of how can we validate or find, where's the evidence for the Gaian mechanism so that we can reduce our understanding of Gaia to causal dynamics. So he said, okay, now we believe in Gaia because we see the mechanisms, and that would be like the proof of Gaia. And of course, that evidence is still in process. Whether it will ever be definitively just hammered down, I can't say. I'm not a scientist. But it's an open question, but I think just because it's an open question doesn't mean we shouldn't try to think as consequentially as possible with Gaia as a provocation to raise our ideas to the planetary level where they need to be in our current situation. So yeah, I mean, so yes, Gaia is an human order in that we are relatively inconsequential in an ultimate way to the continuation of Gaia. We're just trying, it's like another part of the cosmos we're trying to wrap our heads around, but meanwhile, it's what it is.
Right. So when you say that, there's a brilliant line in your book where you say that Gaia constructs its own construction. So are we treading the dangerous waters of theology? Because we know that it derives the name from the pagan goddess. So for example, I do remember how Schelling theorized God as a ground which generates its own ground, a kind of self-creation where God wills his own making through an act of grounding. So are we very close to, the kind of theology and science?
I think the resonance with these sort of nature nature philosophical ruminations of the German philosophers is clear, but that's people have often pointed out the sort of that you see in Kant and other German thinkers of that era, sort of these premonitions of self-reference and that autopoiesis. The Yaquis cosmotechnics goes into this in a really interesting way. So I couldn't remember what the passage of my book was where you pulled that out, but I think all I was trying to imply there, it's another way of formulating autopoiesis. It doesn't that an autopoietic system is self-producing. It produces its own production. That's a short definition of autopoiesis. So if Gaia is autopoietic, if that makes sense, then Gaia is constructing its own construction. I think that's all I was really going for. But the other thing is that, I mean, why this isn't theology, right? I hope, is that, I mean, because it's theology that brings in the concept of ground, right? That you know, that God is the ultimate ground. But in good autopoietic theory, you don't talk about the ground. It's not about the ground. It's about form. Okay, and form is constantly reconstituted. Right. So and Varela was very deeply into this with Spencer Brown and laws of form as he was sort of extending the idea of autopoiesis from its original formulations with Maturana. But the point would be that Gaia reproduces its own form. The ground is the environment, is the ultimate environment. That is is the part of the planet that is not Gaia, which is most of it, just in terms of mass of its material being. And then the cosmic environment beyond the top of the biosphere, right? So this is why so Gaia is a film, so to speak, or a bubble. We can come back to this, but the point is that it's a self-constituting or self-producing system, but what reproduces is the form the ground. It operates upon a ground, as every system has to be embedded in an environment, which is its condition of possibility, but the system per se is the reproduction of its own form. The ground is, okay, so that's there. I hope that was an answer to your question.
Yeah, perfect.
And that is, yeah, I don't think of that as driven sort of from a theological idea of but rather it's more like the enactive concept of the ungroundedness, right, of life, basically. I mean, in other words, what life is doing is reproducing its form on the basis of the ground that it has to work with.
Right. So again, while describing Gaia, you have used this brilliant line where you said metabiotic Gaia as a geological system where biotic and the abiotic couple in a loop. I love this definition. So, but it's a far more fitting definition of Gaia, of course, derived from Neocybernetics. So why was there an inclination in Lovelock and Margulis then towards biotic autopoiesis and not for Gaia as a metabiotic system forming its own subsystems?
Well, this is an interesting point of divergence between Lovelock and Margulis. And ultimately, I mean, when Lovelock is right, as far as I'm concerned, he really realized it. So I think this quote here, see, I wouldn't say it's a geological, the point of a metabiotic system is it's that very coupling of the biological and the geological into a meta system, if you will. metabiotic Gaia. But you need the but the autopoietic element is driven from the biological affordance of that system. So it's not it's a biogeological system. That's what I would say. Metabiotic Gaia is a biogeological system. Now, and Lovelock, Lovelock was the more geologically oriented. He was an atmospheric chemist, so he was already kind of an earth scientist. That was his background. Margulis just being a straight ahead geneticist and microbiologist. But Lovelock's best formulations of Gaia, I think, are those where he's very explicit about you need to go just beyond the idea of superorganism or which leaves you in a kind of biotic register and get the coupling with the geological dynamics to have a full definition of the Gaian phenomenon. Now, Margulis was the one who meeting Maturana and Varela and hanging out with them in the 80s really got jazzed by Autopoiesis and read it and tended to read Autopoiesis in its classical form, presented as a theory of life, as a theory of living form. So when she characterizes Gaia, sometimes it will be just sort of, it'll be fairly strictly, she'll call it the sum of the biota, okay? But that's still a biotic formulation. Lovelock would say, no, you've got to bring the sum of the biota to the sum of the geology. And so Margulis, but I think also what Margulis could see was that Lovelock was more willing to kind of discount the biota. And of course, the Novacene is the ultimate discounting of the biota or demotion of the biota, which Margulis would have nothing to do with that. So but the reason why neither of them got to my of this metabiotic sort of synthesis, it basically because neither of them read Niklas Luhmann. That's the short answer. Because Luhmann showed us how to take autopoiesis beyond the biotic occasion. Now, he brought it into psychic and social systems. He still kept it in an ultimately anthropocentric arena of human, of psychic systems and social systems dedicated to the understanding of the human. He was a sociologist after all. But my move, such as it is to borrow. So I call that metabiotic autopoiesis, but he took it towards the medium of meaning for human minds and societies. Okay, but what he showed is that it's conceptually valid, even no matter that Maturana and Varela did not like this, but I think he convinced me anyways that he had produced a rigorous extension of the concept of autopoiesis beyond the biotic occasion. Now, he took it where he wanted to go as a sociologist. What I did was take a metabiotic formulation and take it back to the planetary occasion in order to refine a concept of Gaia that was not sort of stuck in a biotic to get out of the problem of conceptualizing Gaia as a superorganism, because Lovelock was so inconsistent here. He'd just say the Gaia's like the planet is like one living organism. Gaia is the living planetary organ, and he would constantly use, but he was just using, and then he'd say, but no, it was just a metaphor. I did, but still, if I call it a living system, that's a biotic formulation, but you'll still go, oh, well, gee, it's alive, and therefore we shouldn't kill it for no reason, or so, that had to do with sort of how he worked around the question of Gaian ethics. But scientifically considered, Margulis constantly said, no, Gaia is not. I mean, her biotic formulation, what she would say is that Gaia is the ecosystem of all ecosystems. And the ecosystem concept is already metabiotic. The ecosystem is the system composed of life forms among each other within an environment. That's essentially the geology, right? I mean, the niches, the physical or geological. But as we know, at the place where Gaia is, the geology is constantly being decomposed and recomposed by moving through living systems, right? So that our geology is metabiotic after 3.5 billion years of life churning the elements of the material planet together. We live on what Margulis calls a once autopoietic planet. Even it's not living because it's gone through a living process and being redeposited as the environmental ground of the continuation of the system, and as part of the material elementality of the system itself. So let's see here. So, but the formulation of a metabiotic system forming its own subsystems, that's right out of Luhmann. That is an extension of social systems theory into Gaia theory. And all I could say is that's my gambit. If that's a crock, then, well, you'll have to decide what you think of that. But that's how I got there.
Right. My next one is a bit provocative, probably. So we know that second order cybernetic is about autonomy of self-referential systems. So could you shed some light on Donna Haraway moving away from autopoiesis to symbionts and sympoiesis, right? So has she not herself moved away from the boundary distinction in cyborg Gaia to posthumous humans as extensions of the earth with the help of Camille stories? Again, we are coming to science fiction as if. So do you think this movement is a positive understanding of Gaia?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the opportunity. So in I think it's chapter 2 of Gaian Systems that I recovered this mid-90s introduction Haraway wrote, I think, to the Cyborg Handbook. I think that was the occasion. So what I've been able to establish through my archival research is that Haraway and Margulis were corresponding with each other. And Margulis sent Haraway a preliminary copy of What is Life that was first published in 1995. So in the earlier 90s, Haraway gets the manuscript of What is Life, and What is Life is full of autopoietic presentation. The concept of autopoiesis in that really excellent work by Margulis and Sagan, it is thoroughly integrated into their presentation of evolutionary dynamics. And so Haraway reads this, and she sees Margulis talking autopoiesis. And so when she writes this introduction to the Cyborg Handbook, she just throws the term autopoiesis around, and she does footnote Margulis, but you wouldn't necessarily know that she wasn't reading Maturana and Varela. She was just reading Margulis's manuscript. And so, so as near as I could figure it out, Donna Haraway was never really invested in the concept of autopoiesis, except insofar as she saw it there in Margulis and then just kind of pulled it out and riffed on it. Okay. And that's what, and so my sense, so it isn't that she was ever an autopoietic thinker in the first place. She kind of played around with it and then thought, yeah, but it seems so, it's like most of the people that don't like this concept, it's like, it's auto. They don't like the auto. Right? So because the self, we don't like the bourgeois self. The self is bad. So we don't like the auto of autopoiesis. To me, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But that's why eventually Haraway comes up with sympoiesis, which is just a squashing together of symbiosis, which is Margulis's great concept. I mean, really where her profound importance rests is not with her participation in the elaboration of Gaia with Lovelock, which of course is super important, but with the resurrection and the reestablishment of the concept of symbiosis as a fundamental ecological, biological dynamic, right? And for her, then Gaia is just the ultimate, it is the sum of all symbioses, you might put it that way, for Margulis. Now, so eventually Haraway says, okay, because what we know about life and what we want from life is collectivity, and we want, especially among, however you want to take it, it's the coming together of life forms with other life forms of the same and different kinds, and so you have this symbiotic vision, which is essentially parallel to Margulis's vision. So she coins the term sympoiesis. That's all well and good, but it's just a riff. You see, which is what Haraway's always doing. It's a riff. It's a philosophical riff, and which is to say, it's a rhetorical gesture. It's not an articulated concept like autopoiesis is in the work of Maturana and Varela. So my point is just, Donna's use is fine, but you shouldn't assume from this that autopoiesis is a defunct concept or has been superseded without an autopoiesis, without an understanding of autopoiesis, which is by which you have a living phenomenon in its individuation, right? In its self, that's the foundation of all living phenomena. Without autopoiesis, nothing. No chance for sympoiesis. Okay, so be as sympoietic as you want to be, but you've still got to ground the phenomenon in the autopoiesis that is the condition of that possibility. So that's my argument there. I don't know if I've got a comment on the rest of your question. I haven't,
because she moves away from the term post-human and does something
right. Well, she was never a big fan of the post-human for other reasons, or of hanging her hat on the concept of post-humanism, and she offers her arguments for that, and I think, I never found that any reason for me not to continue to think of what I was doing as a variety of post-humanist thought. So I'm perfectly fine with that. It really comes down, the problem of boundary, see that the autopoietic issue forces the question of boundaries. An autopoietic system produces a boundary as part of its self-production. And you just can't say boundaries are bad, but they're also not absolute, as living systems show us. They're permeable. You got to have a boundary, but you have to be able to move the boundary is the principle of cognition. Without a boundary, no cognition. There's no seat. There's no seat for cognition to occur without a differential between the internal process that cognizes and the environment beyond which you are. So, I just say, for all Donna Haraway's brilliant, she spawned a lot of bad theorization for people to just want to say, let's throw out the concept of boundary and everything merges and splurges into it. And you're left with a mishmash. And anyways, that's my critique.
And is it perhaps the same thing that Lovelock is doing in Novocene, I think? On the other extreme of it, do you think it's the other extreme of what Lovelock is doing, machines taking over, and here you have the Camille butterfly, where the butterfly and the human coming together, two species coming together, I think.
Yeah, I have not, I just haven't checked out that part of Haraway's recent stuff, so I can't really comment on that, but as you characterize it, to me it sounds like a sort of post-cyborg formation where you've got this but it's two different distinct organisms merge in some fashion. Well, I mean, that's a riff on symbiosis and maybe biotechnology. So I think she's thinking of Oncomouse and the whole, that aspect of the sort of the meddling, the power that our biotechnology has now seized to play around with hybridizing, genetics. Who knows where all that will go? The ultimate question is, can you produce a viable organism? Yeah, you can, ultimately, can you set that butterfly free and have it make its way in the world? If so, then that's evolution. A kind of, and that would be Margulis. I think Margulis would say, if our technology is not distinct from the total Gaian panorama, and the effects that we have on the biosphere are absorbed into the total Gaian panorama, but just exactly how that will sort itself out is anybody's guess.
Right. So do you subscribe to Stenger's argument of Gaia as the intruder, the transcendental entity, as opposed to capitalist transcendence? So is the pandemic evidence of the unpredictability of Gaia and its counterbalance?
Well, I'm perfectly happy. I speak to, in Catastrophic Times, the Stenger's volume where she brings out Gaia the intruder, but I read it as a cosmopolitical gesture. Here again, to me, Gaia the intruder is a philosophical riff. It's not a scientific statement. So it's a figure of thought by which to wrap your head around what other people call the Anthropocene. So I think of, I'm happy to think of Gaia as unpredictable, but the pandemic, but from a kind of a Gaian observation, the pandemic is just, it's, the sadness of the pandemic is strictly with regard to its disruption of the human order, of our lives. We care about it. Gaia doesn't really care about the pandemic. No, Gaia's not. I mean, so the counter, but I mean, the violence is the capitalist order. I mean, there's the violence that we're talking about, right? The violence against the biosphere is driven by extractivist capitalism. And that's what Stenger's, that's the point of our argument. We've got to stop ripping out the bowels of the earth as if there's no tomorrow. And so Gaia, so Gaia and the intruder is just her metaphor for the blowback that we're receiving, one form of which is the pandemic. Insofar as we brought it on ourselves by disturbing the ecosystems where the virus was just hanging out, just, in a localized fashion. But now it's gone global because we're a global species, our pioneer species reaching the limits of our petri dish.
Right. So in one of the most fascinating chapters in your book, you trace the history of the thinkers of Gaia, right, from the cybernetic systems theory of Lovelock to symbiogenesis and autopoiesis of Margulis, and finally to the anti-systemic actor network theory of Latour. So how have you personally extracted your own conception of metabiotic Gaia, which is more of a composite systemic assemblage? Are you focusing more on the performative aspects of Gaia? I think you have muted yourself. Have you? Yeah. The screen has frozen.
You've frozen up there. Well,
it's perfect. Yeah, no, it's perfect.
Okay, no, we just had a little freeze frame. No, I was asking you, just give me a quick shot on what you mean by performative in the context of the question you asked about focusing more on the performative aspects of Gaia.
So are you trying to look at Gaia in as something which is continuously producing, reproducing, and engaging with the, something as an end product of a kind of acting between biotic and metabiotic and abiotic and abiotic system? Are you looking at Gaia as something which is continuously evolving, focusing more?
Yeah, I think I would agree with all that, but I don't think, my sense is that the
screen has frozen again.
For us, Gaia is essentially static. Although it's moving faster now because the disruptions to global systems that we've induced are moving at a pace that's like the wildfires on the west coast of here or up in Siberia, right? These are, these are happening in real time as perceived by humans, and they're catastrophes. But to me, Gaia is the ultimate backdrop of all these phenomena. It's the condition of the possibility of life altogether on this planet, right? And as such, its own performance is imperceptible, I think,
right.
And not sort of, and doesn't it, and it, so then, let's see here. But getting back to the previous part of your question, the way I talked about this some before, the way that my metabiotic Gaia conception developed was by kind of working Luhmann and Latour off each other. Now, this is a whole other can of worms, as we say. Latour does not like Luhmann's sociology at all. Luhmann will at least cite Latour every now and then, but the point is, but I, as a systems theoretical thinker, I mean, essentially what's in Gaian systems is my critique of Latour. See, I don't think actor network theory is adequate, is entirely adequate to describe Gaia. I think Latour's version of Gaia, although I honor and applaud Latour's interest in Gaia, and I think it's, you know, altogether a good development. But we quibble about the details of just how it, you know, and he kind of fits it into an actor network frame. My problem, but he doesn't. To me, the problem there is his conception is not adequately systematized. There's no closure. There's no operational closure. I mean, that's the system concept. Okay, operational closure, by which the system recurs upon itself to create a unity of operation for that system. And that's the boundary question, once again, by which a system you know, produces its own operation and then is in a condition to consort with other systems, however that might take place. For me, actor network theory is still too atomized. It's really still too, I mean, it's about, yes, it's about collectivities and about the assembly of collectivities, but what's missing, I'll just leave it at that. For me, what's missing is that final step that actually systematizes the network or the assembly. So it's not just distributed, and it's not, yeah, it's not an open structure of elements, but rather has that condition of operational closure that by which the system falls into its systematicity, such that its operations are internal and self-produced. And so we're back to the autopoietic concept again.
Right. So, but when I'm referring to a kind of performativity of Gaia, I'm also referring to how you're moving away from any kind of philosophizing of it, or you're moving away from, let's say, you know, of Gaia as a kind of living organism. But then are you also focusing on how Gaia is continuously interacting with species continuously? So, and how we...
No, I don't see it that way. I see it as see, for living organisms, Gaia is the environment. Gaia, I mean, it's a system, but it's a system that produces an environment because we're inside it. Now, here I agree with Latour completely. We're inside Gaia. That's how we have to we're not above it, we're inside it. So, because what it produces in its own sort of planetary substantiality is the conditions of possibility for living beings to emerge and live out their lives all together. So it doesn't have to do anything except except that its performance is registered in the maintenance of the habitability of the planet. That's classic Gaia theory, right? What it does is maintain the planet habitable. And that's a very grand performance. We need, so I'll say that is its performance. The conditions of habitability have been held within a very constrained set of parameters, of which temperature is one of the main keys. And that's part of the theory, right? That Gaia is an air conditioner. That surely through physics, this planet ought to be 40 degrees centigrade hotter than it is. And we're doing our best to get it back up to non-biotic conditions. But what Gaia is doing by the summation of, by its metabiotic merger of the biology and the geology is maintaining the atmosphere. Now that we're in part of Gaia's evolution was to go from anoxic through the great oxidation event to absorb the great oxidation event of 2.2 billion years ago, by which the atmosphere gradually rose to its 21% oxygen level. And then the theory goes, operates to hold the complexion of the atmosphere, in which aerobic organisms have now evolved and now sort of genetically stamped with the expectation for a world of 20% oxygen in the atmosphere. And that level is maintained relatively steady over hundreds of millions of years. And that's what Gaia is doing. That's Gaia's performance.
Right. So in my next question, I'll shift a little bit to the sociological implications of boundaries in humans borrowing from microorganisms. So primarily boundaries are there in an organism to grow internally, in a protected grouping or coupling, shielding itself from the external environment. So do we find instances of proliferation at the cost of destruction of another organism, or is everything coexisting harmoniously in the self-regulatory Gaia? So do we have anything to learn from the microbes on the ethical plane?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, this is tricky. I don't think you get a sociobiology out of Gaia theory. This is why you need Luhmann. I mean, Luhmann's not a Gaian thinker, but he's a systems thinker. And I think the crucial thing, the theory of autopoiesis begins at the biological level, and therefore the boundary of a living system is a membrane. Just take it down to the cellular starting point. Life begins by cutting itself out of the environment by producing a membrane that then, and that becomes the cognitive organ by which an inside and an outside is differentiated, and the process proceeds on the inside of the membrane. So as long as you're thinking strictly and concretely about living systems, you've got the membrane, the boundaries are material. The boundaries they're self-produced, but they're made out of molecules. Now, as you shift into the human situation and now in social systems, there you've got the psychic system and the social system. And Luhmann calls them autopoietic. But now, and that is to mean that they are bounded as systems. They are bounded operations, but the boundaries are not material any longer. They're virtual. Metabiotic systems have virtual boundaries. That is in the human sphere. In other words, just going back to the philosophy of self and non-self, right? That our mental operations generate a distinction mechanism by which we say that's me, but that's not me. Okay, and we know, of course, that boundary is porous, but it's the condition of having a sense of a self. Now move that out into social systems where it's an autopoiesis of communication. So in other words, the boundary mechanisms of metabiotic, of psychic and social systems are take place in the medium of meaning, which is the in that theorization, that's the sort of common ground by which psychic operation and social operation couple together, even in their distinction and in their distinct autopoiesis. Okay, so boundaries apply, but they're not material. They're created by the processing of distinctions. Okay, and the internalizing within to begin with in the human mind of the distinction between system and environment. Okay, so all of that is classic Luhmann. So now that's why, but it's an intriguing question. In other words, but that's why, you know, I wouldn't rest a sociobiology on the life ways of microorganisms. Do we have anything to learn from microbes on the ethical plane? Or, well, let me back up. You asked about whether there's Gaia implies a harmonious integration. I mean, not necessarily. I mean, still there is jostling. There's got to be, you know, life forms are always jostling against each other and forming collectivities and symbioses. I mean, it's a constant reshuffling. But it would seem that the evidence is fairly clear that the idea of what we call, from our kind of human perspective, a healthy ecosystem is one in which the jostling arrives at a kind of sort of mutual distribution so that no one element tends to overbear the others. Okay, and of course that's why capitalism is such a problem now, because it's strictly the sort of what do they call, the weaponization of a winner-take-all strategy. And that's not, Gaia doesn't, you know, to use these metaphors, that's just not how the planet works. But on the ethical plane, it seems what we learn from, and there's some wonderful films of Margulis where I think this is the point that she's making. What we can learn from the microbes is recycling. That's how they live. Okay, I mean, and that they form they form colonies of different kinds, but one can live on the waste of the other. No organism can live on its own waste. Margulis constantly makes that point. You have the waste, your own wastes need to be flushed away. You need a medium, you need an environment that can do that for you. But these bacterial colonies on these, like on the, I forget the name. Anyways, she shows how they kind of form layers, and so that there's as a kind of Gaian consortium, as a mutualistic symbiotic Gaian consortium, they are recycling each other's waste for each other, and the whole community benefits. And that's what, you know, I mean, to me, I say okay, so this is my science fiction riff. So, okay, so you say we're inventing intelligent machines. Okay, fine, but they have no purpose. I mean, what good are they unless we can put them to a task, you know, that's ecologically beneficial. So just put all the AIs on the job of recycling the waste of human production. Put the AIs on the job of getting us reintegrated with the planetary ecology. I mean, what better use could there be? And we can look to our friends, the microbes, for a kind of concrete demonstration that microbes live, like, you know, are sort of colonize the planet everywhere, up, down, way down, down into the mantle. We know the perfusion of the microbial world is the most consequential aspect of the biosphere. I mean, we're just human beings and other mammals and stuff. We're just gnats. I mean, you know, we're as far as the ultimate planetary dynamics, but they live out, they persist over billions of years. This is a great point Margulis makes. Bacteria don't go extinct because they're not species. They just persist, but they persist because they recycle. In other words, they generate their own environment and they clean it up as they go. So that's the ethical ideal, if you want one. It seems to me that we could, but otherwise we just have to deal with the kind of minds that we've been dealt, and you know, and sort of all the sociology, the societal dynamics that we produce through communication or miscommunication, but I mean, that's the, you know, that's the human sociality, that completely on a different plane from the kind of chemical, you know, other kinds of organisms. We use the term communication, and there's some cognitive interaction of chemical messages, semiochemicals, like, for instance, now we know the forests talk, right? But through the production of aerosols, specifically in response to an infestation or whatever it might be, that so you've got this chemical communication going on at other levels of the biosphere, but we don't do that. Except we've got pheromones, you know. It's a minor part of our communicative repertoire, is because we still, in fact, produce pheromones, but they're not the super significant relative to, this thing we're doing now, communicating ideas, and possibly determining our behavior in terms of the ideas that we possess.
Right. Let's for a moment focus on this very paradoxical definition that you've given of autopoietic Gaia, where you mentioned that it is a kind of self-reproducing but non-reproducing entity. So I'm more concerned with a new organism that might get created out of the self-regulatory behavior of Gaia. So let us imagine a foreign element that is not an outcome of microbial reactions. Isn't Gaia reproductive then?
Well, I need to take this back to the issue. The neo-Darwinist argument against Gaia that emerged from a guy like Dawkins back in the 80s was that evolutionary dynamics were entirely due to the process of natural selection, and natural selection demands populations of individuals that can then differentially survive or not survive. And because Gaia is a population of one, there's no way that it can be part of a natural selective process. And so how can such a thing even come to be or then evolve? It seems like, I always thought that was a completely bonkers argument. But in any event, Maturana and Varela, see, this goes back to the original presentation of autopoiesis. Because the mainstream biology, mainstream evolutionary thinking was totally oriented to reproduction, right? That some reproduce and some don't. Mutations occur. Once in a million, it's beneficial, and so that's the one that's preserved because that then has survival value, and the whole bit, right? The whole classic standard evolutionary scenario. And when Maturana and Varela introduced autopoiesis, to saying, but wait a second, no organism survives in order to reproduce unless it maintains its own life in the first place. And that was autopoiesis, right? Which is the principle of the self-maintenance of the living system, irrespective of reproduction. Now, of course, it's not that reproduction isn't essential, but it's an epiphenomenon of the fundamental existence that is, or you could say what reproduction reproduces is the capacity for autopoiesis, okay? So this was very important to Margulis. I mean, when Margulis took up autopoiesis into her own biological thinking, it was part of her campaign to get away from the neo-Darwinist overemphasis on survival of the reproducers, okay? Because symbiosis is symbiosis doesn't have to do with reproduction, although now we know we've got this idea of the holobiont, and that in fact, but the process by which, say, the baby being born coming down the mama's birth canal picks up the bacterial complement, right? So in other words, the microbiome is passed on, but not genetically, it's passed on environmentally. Okay, so and so there are all these dynamics that were being pushed to the margins because they didn't have to do strictly with survival of the fittest through reproductive fitness and all that stuff. Okay, so that's why that distinction is important. And so I'm just kind of glossing Margulis when I say Gaia is self-producing but not reproducing, because it's not like it's not giving birth. And that's why it's not a planetary living organism, because living organisms reproduce, but Gaia doesn't really produce a second Gaia. It just persists. So with regard to a new organism, I'm not sure how to process that idea unless you gave me a new planet to put a new Gaia on. Otherwise, what you've just got is the idea that Gaia does evolve because, and this is, and both Lovelock and Margulis, I think we're happy with the idea that evolution of species are the sort of our elemental phenomena within the evolution of Gaia. As species evolve, Gaia evolves, and probably there's you would imagine a feedback loop there, but so there's innovation, there's change. This is basic systems theory. An autopoietic system cannot stay the same, right? It needs, and social systems are sort of the obvious. We need the news. We need jazz. We need improvisation. We need crazy ass people spouting weird, we don't need all the weirdness we've got, but communication constantly needs to reformulate. It just can't, it just can't repeat the same loop over and over again. And we see that's not what happens with life either. I mean, life evolves just by reproducing, and that's standard evolutionary thought. So I don't know what the new organism will be. I mean, maybe we will work out a metamorphic biotech to splice ourselves into other life forms and create something new. If that happens, presumably there'll be a kind of Gaian reciprocity. Where that will lead, I can't say.
So again, so in popular culture, especially in Hollywood these days, or in independent films as well, we see in recent eco-horror films, Gaia is often represented as a mysterious nature, earth goddess bent on vengeance, or some dark matter under which humans lose their sanity. So a lot has been written regarding its shape, size, and properties, right from it being a bubble between two environments, a living entity, to a membrane a few kilometers in length. How do you visualize Gaia?
Yeah, well, I think you picked up those images from my from the book, where I've got a section called Gaia's Boundaries, right. Where I work through this very question. As far as all the sort of the pop cultural, I mean, that is what it is. But it doesn't really have anything to do with Gaia. It's those, but in any event, and now I'm borrowing from Tyler Volk and his book called Gaia's Body Towards a Physiology of Earth, and he came up with this visualization that I like very much, and that I present in my book, that Gaia, if you try to visualize it as an entity, right? Not just as sort of diffuse environment, because for us inside Gaia, that's the problem. Gaia is impalpable, like the atmosphere, okay? But substantially, the atmosphere is Gaian. I mean, we're moving through that. But that it's a bubble, right? It's a bubble on the surface of a sphere. It's a film, okay? And this is picking up on, and so for Latour, it's the critical zone. And he talks about a membrane or a film. And I think that image is appropriate, right? So it's not a sphere exactly, it's a film about 20 kilometers in breadth from the top of the biotically, for the geobiologically Gaian maintained atmosphere up to so the upper edge is diffuse, right? As the atmosphere gets more attenuated, but that's the surface, that's the outer surface, which then gradually just attenuates into space. And then the lower, the ventral surface is the edge of the biosphere, as that now has dove in to the crust and the mantle of the planet. So it's a really interesting, there's a paper called Gaia's Microbiome, which is about the dark ecology, not Tim Morton's dark ecology, but just that there's all kinds of microbial action, life going on deeper down than we ever imagined. And so again, it's a kind of diffuse, so Gaia doesn't have a membrane like a cell has a membrane, but it has, because its borders are diffuse, but nevertheless, we arrive at a place where Gaia is no more. As we move out into space, we arrive at a place where Gaia has been left behind if we go sufficiently deep into the earth. So what I say is that Gaia is a membrane. It doesn't have a membrane. It is a membrane. And that's the film that covers the entire planet. It's a living, if you want to say that, it's a Gaian membrane around the planet. So that's how I visualize Gaia. But you have to kind of balance out the relative diffuseness of the Gaian environment as opposed to any actually living system in which the boundedness is palpable, right? Because it's just like the membrane of a cell or the epidermis of a mammal type being.
Right. So would you agree with Maturana and Varela's reading of our autopoietic immunological responses as Gaia acting inside our bodies? Is individual knowledge of Gaia primarily cellular and microbial and never empirical?
Well, you're referring to some portions of the book where I found a fairly unknown article by Varela, where he kind of brings Gaia into his immunological thinking. So I think the way I read it is that he makes a kind of ecological metaphor that as he's trying to change our ideas about the immune system. Again, the immune system is not, in his reconception, a kind of survival, a militarized, right? Antibodies on the prowl to like snuff out any invaders from the outside world, but rather that as we now, he was way out in front, basically, on the immunological line of our understanding of the microbiome. So he's saying that insofar as the immune system recruits microbes for the microbiome and operates in order to preserve sort of a healthy internal ecology of the microbiome, it's a microcosm of what Gaia is doing for the planet. It's not that Gaia is in us, but it's a comparable scene of mutualistic collectivity, and for which then our bodies are Gaia, all right, as he unfolds this kind of ecological metaphor. That's the way I read it. So for a microbe in our gut, our body, where it lives, where it carries out its term of existence, might as well be a planet. We are the planet. We are the planetary bodies of our own microbiome. And within us, there's a consortium of all these different kinds of microorganisms and fungi and protists and all the rest of it, not just bacteria and archaea, but health is the consortial sorting out of a live and let live strategy. And the immune system is really part of that, as well as providing the kind of defense against pathogen thing that was the total orientation of immunological thinking prior to Varela and his colleagues, and which is foregrounded by the vaccine. So there's still that. Thank God, the defensive work of the immune system and the way it can be boosted now through human technology is just phenomenal. but it's an allegory by which to think about Gaia. As I understand what he's saying there, as opposed to, but, I mean, there is a kind of sense in thinking that if we're inside Gaia, Gaia is inside us. To me, that if you want to look at it that way, the resonances are there.
Right. So we are near the end. So what is the role of astrobiology or exobiology in our efforts to protect the Gaia in the Anthropocene epoch?
Actually, I don't see that it has a broad connection here. Part of astrobiology has to do with asteroid defense. In fact, that would be the level I see it. I mean, there are people that are worried, and you hear about, they're just like the comet that hit Earth, and that was the end of the dinosaurs. It's a cosmological phenomenon, and it's part of the Earth's history. And it's an ongoing phenomenon. So there, so there's a side of astrobiology that's like proactively saying, we need to have the technology ready to go. And this has already been made into movies, right? That when the killer asteroid is threatening life on the planet, we've got the tools by which to prevent mass destruction. Otherwise, exobiology and astrobiology are kind of they're names under which NASA created a kind of research program into the question of life beyond the Earth. Okay, and in fact, Gaia theory informs it very profoundly because with the exoplanets, so all the exoplanets are of recent discovery, right? But Lovelock would say, just make a spectrographic analysis of their atmosphere. If it's far from thermodynamic equilibrium, that's the biosignature. The biosignature is an improbable far from equilibrium composition that, in order to remain far from equilibrium, needs to be continuously pumped up by life forms, because that's how it works on Earth, right? So there's this interesting, in a way, Gaia theory is the return of astrobiology upon the Earth rather than looking out beyond the Earth to life elsewhere, but putting life on this planet in cosmological context.
Right. So this is my last question. I'm going to read a very small part of your portion from your book and then ask my question. So towards the end of the book, you write, and I'm quoting, the immune system's primary concern is not to search out and destroy anything labeled as non-self, but rather to hold together the many selves of the holobiotic ecosystem, composed of the animal host coupled to its own microbiome, by identifying, tolerating, and recruiting beneficial microbial symbionts. Only the occasional bad microbial actors are targeted for removal, unquote. So if this is true of all holobionts, of course, including human beings, with regards to the ongoing pandemic, let's say, where do you think we are failing or have failed?
Right. The quote you just read out is from that section that we were talking about just now, about the reconception of the immune system as enabling our bodies to be holobionts, right? That we have these robust microbiomes that are now completely co-evolved with with our own genetics, so that we talk now about a hologenome, right? Which is the extended genome of, and usually we're thinking about, although it doesn't have to be an animal host. I mean, it could be a plant host or what have you. But that the immune system, in fact, promotes the probiotic consorting and preservation of a healthy microbiome. If I understand the way you formed the question, so if we now say that Gaia is a holobiont, why can we expect a Gaian version of these sort of individuated of the dynamics of health within sort of an animal host holobiont to reproduce themselves? I would say here that if you, the problem here would be you're reverting to a biotic, you're going back to Gaia as an organism, except now we know that the organism is a holobiontic, is a is composed of many organisms. And that makes it, and that's why the body, the animal host with its microbiome is an allegory of Gaia, right? But again, it's a kind of figurative transposition. So from which you can't necessarily expect Gaia to now like proactively solve our problems for us by restoring. I mean, and here again, the ultimate problem is the differential and temporal scales. I mean, Gaia will sort things out, but if it has any intention at all, which, again, when that's tricky, but the effect of its own persistence is the maintenance of habitability. But habitability is still a precarious situation. It doesn't mean that life is easy. It just means it's possible. Right? Here's your condition of habitability. Now you figure out how to live. Okay, that's what I expect from Gaia. But if we don't get a handle on global warming and it just kind of destroys human civilization, something will survive, presumably, and gradually one could expect that. I mean, what Lovelock expects to happen if we don't get a handle on the greenhouse effect that we're creating that's warming the planet, that Gaia will reset, right? Because its ultimate environmental conditions will now have shifted. So it'll reset to a hotter planet, and some life forms will be able to hack it. And that'll be what Gaia is, if that were to happen. But again, we're talking about hundreds and thousands and millions of years. We just have to, Gaia will hack it, but it won't happen in time for us, because our temporality is much too momentaneous relative to the Gaian temporality. So we gotta, in other words, Gaia ain't coming to the rescue. We gotta work it out for ourselves. We gotta get right with Gaia. You could put it that way, but it's up to us, using Gaia as a way to conceive what's being asked of us, just with regard to our own preservation as a species and as a civilization. That's how I think about it. It's, but we can't pray to Gaia and expect anything to happen. We can't expect Gaia to come to our rescue. But we can realize that we're here at all because life had a chance to persist, and it produced the and insofar Gaia is a emergent phenomenon from the arrival of life, or the the origin of life on this planet, which is not a question that Gaia addresses, as evolution doesn't have an answer for that. But in any event, Gaia is an emergent systemic phenomenon rising out of the initial proliferation of life on the planet. And then once Gaia was there, now you had a reciprocity between the planetary ecosystem, Gaia, and individual organisms trying to make their way and evolving in the process.
Right, to say it more bluntly, what I meant was humans are the only holobionts which are failing, depleting. Won't you say that?
No, no, there's plenty of pathologies to go around. But I think a lot of them are, but we're screwing with the ecosystem, creating, there's horrible diseases that are going through lots of non-human, lots of other, like bats, for instance, these horrible infections so we're trashing the habitat for our co-inhabitants, and it's, and we're at fault for that. But I don't think, again, the Gaian view would be, in all of this, you've got to reintegrate the human into the planetary panorama, into the entirety of the biodiversity in which we participate. And to me, that's the ethical ideal. Ultimately, we're out of. We thought we ran the show, and now we see we ran the show off the cliff, and in fact, which means we don't run the show. We're just part of the show. But we're screwing up the picture for for lots of other life forms that really have no say in what we're doing. And so that's part of posthumanism as well. Give the trees a vote. Give the river, make rivers political entities. Let the rivers have a say in the decisions that are made, right? All this kind of thing that's happening now. To me, this is the recognition of Gaia. This is the way we recognize Gaia as the the ultimate condition of our possibility. So. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Clarke. We'll just shift to some of the questions now.
Man, we just carried on. That's because there's just so much there in this wonderful book.
Yeah, this is an amazing book. Yes. Yes, there are so many questions. My God, we'll just take a few of them.
Okay.
So Shayon Bhattacharya, will you like to come, switch on your audio and video and ask directly?
Thank you, Asijit. Thank you for a most interesting discussion. I had a question that I put up there a while ago. Going back to something that was mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the idea of sense making, and at the scale of the very small to increasingly larger scales. And it occurred to me that in in one of her books, co-written with Orion Sagan, Dazzle Gradually, if I recall correctly, there's a chapter where Margulis says that, well, you know, the universe might be a kind of system that not only, you know, over time the entropy of which increases, but maybe it's in the nature of the universe to favor the increase of entropy. And so the complex structures that we see, such as human civilization or hurricanes that wreak a lot of destruction and havoc, or human civilization, you know, increasing the entropy of the universe by burning fossil fuel and so on. So these are kind of fallout of the nature of the universe itself, because it's the kind of thing that tries to increase the entropy, and whatever increases the entropy will therefore be favored by the universe. Now, without anthropomorphizing or getting into panpsychism or mysticism, I'm wondering, you know, what connections can we make between this sort of thinking and the idea of sense making? I mean, would it be appropriate to say that the universe at the most, you know, large scale thing that we can imagine is itself engaged in a kind of sense making? And I'm thinking here of, you know, A.N. Whitehead and process philosophy, which I don't quite see mentioned very much in connection with posthumanism, at least in my own very limited readings. So yeah, there's some thoughts, not very well formed thoughts, that I want you to throw out.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a pretty robust recent literature on Whitehead. I haven't partaken in that myself, but I think it's right alongside the post-humanist discourse, if not mixed into it. Now, with regard to the thermodynamic framing of the Gaian issue, my assumption would be that's Dorian Sagan. That's one of Dorian's contributions to Dazzle Gradually, which has a number of essays that are co-authored by Margulis, and those tend to be sort of strictly more or less working through Lin science with Dorian as co-author. But Dorian has, as a kind of philosopher of the biosphere, has developed his own thermodynamic approach to these problems and phenomena. And personally, I've never found it to displace my preference for the autopoietic perspective, which is really, which I think is which amounts to a kind of an emergent phenomenon that is transversal to thermodynamic flow. So this is actually, I have a section in my previous book called Cycle and Flow. So thermodynamics is all about the flow of energy, obviously, and the distribution of order within the cosmos. So I think that within the terms of that argument, the kinds of dynamics and the emergence of form, right? The negentropic aspect of the interplay of what as entropy is evacuated from the system, that's a dynamic that creates order. And so if you want to call the order that is sort of is produced by like a hurricane, like in your example, or a cyclone, as we call it, right, is a meteorological but it's a physical phenomenon that's strictly driven by heat differentials operating on the on the hydrosphere and the atmosphere, right? And so you get this kind of flow going that then recurs upon itself, and you get the cyclic, you get this creation of form. And then it dissipates. But what the cyclone did was dissipate the heat differential that brought it into being. Now, if you want to call that sense making, I've got no problem with that as a way of putting these sort of different discourses together. But it sort of in the discourse itself, where sense making emerges as a concept, it comes out of the autopoietic discourse, right? And so to me, what's crucial is that the fundamental living phenomenon can be conceptualized thermodynamically, but what that misses is the closure of autopoietic operation, because thermodynamics it's about flow and form, but as we see, the form is really, it's a passing phenomenon. The form doesn't persist. Once the entropy is dissipated, the form is gone. But that's not how it works with living systems. The form persists and the flow of energy through the system is part of it, creates a form, but the persistence has to do with the autopoietic dynamics, not with the thermodynamic dynamics. Okay.
So the next question is from Shutirtho. Shutirtho, would you want to come online? Switch on your.
Am I audible?
You're audible, yes.
Yeah.
Where do we place a post-human ethics while talking about Gaia, which consists of both living and non-living entities as we know it? Because, like, how do we negotiate?
Can you just be slower? I think that'll be better.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. Okay, no problem.
Okay. Where do we place a post-human ethics while talking about Gaia, which consists of both living and non-living entities as we know it? How do we negotiate or process or even reconcile the existence of microbes, animals, plants, or object matter with ourselves, as in the human being? And where or when do we decide to terminate other entities for self-preservation? Where do we even draw the line between this self-preservation and exploitation?
Wow. Well, those are deep and complex issues. But drawing those lines is what post-humanist ethics is all about. I wouldn't want to foreclose any particular strategies. To me, but if we put those issues in the Gaian frame, for me, what that means is the way I express it is just a reintegration into the community of life in particular, because that's the crucial. The geology, geology is there, but it's really the backdrop of the living phenomenon that needs to preserve its biodiversity in order to sustain the kind of habitability that we find comfortable. So now, deciding, the biopolitical question of what gets to live and what gets to die, that, I don't know, that's a hard issue. Obviously, we are the kinds of organisms that, we are heterotrophs, biologically speaking. In other words, much of life lives on, basically all life that isn't photosynthetic lives by consuming other life, either when it's living or after it's died, right? Or or animals eat the leaves of plants, they may or may, or of trees or whatever it happens to be. In other words, I mean, the human, the sort of industrial agriculture and industrial livestock or whatever you call it, I mean, has become sort of made evident as the animal studies, the animal oriented side of posthumanism, makes clear is that by and large, we're still operating on obsolete assumptions about our relationship to other living beings. These life ways are so deeply embedded that disentangling ourselves from the exploitation of other life in order to, what we're seeing is that as we exploit other life, we're not preserving our life anymore. We're imperiling our life by the mode of exploitation that we're putting on other life, or just the complete obliviousness that we have to habitat to allow other, our fellow planet mates, a place to be, a place to, room to live. Okay. So all of that has to be on the table for rethinking and political reorganization, social reorganization, ethical transformation. So, I mean, in a nutshell, that's how I would put the two main sides that you were asking about with regard to posthumanism and the idea of Gaia.
Yeah, right. So thank you so much, Professor Clarke, for your reflections on interrelational existences, climate change, Anthropocene concerns, and of course, post-human futures. I hope we will have such great sessions with you again in the near future. And thank you so much.
Well, let me thank you, Asijit.
Yes.
And your colleagues there who've remained for the entirety of this conversation. I appreciate your sticking with it. But it was my pleasure. I was interested to find what I would say when you asked me to make a pronouncement on these really important issues that we're taking up here. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Thank you.
Have a nice day, my friends.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time.
Next time. Yes. Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.